Social structures. So, contrary to some popular representations of primates, and in particular non-human primates, as we'll see, many of the species that we're talking about do not live in some sort of chaotic state of nature. Rather, they live primarily in groups, but also, as we'll start to see, very systematically organized groups with very complex internal relationships. Social structures is one of the things that we're primarily interested here in this section. But before we do that, I also want us to step back and sort of reconsider, building upon our material from last week. Again, why is it that we here in physical anthropology are devoting so much time and attention to non-humans? As we noted before, we're talking mostly about the primate order, of which humans are one amongst many species in this order. And as you'll start to see more and more this week, we're not always talking about or comparing humans to all members of the primate order, especially when we start to get into the behaviors that distinguish different segments of the order. We tend to focus our attention more on apes and old and new world monkeys, with some exceptions here and there. We noted last week that there's a lot of physical characteristics that are sort of commonly shared amongst species within the primate grouping, right? A lot of it having to do with our generalized structures, which lend themselves to kind of greater adaptive flexibility. But we also start to observe that there's a lot of overlap in terms of behaviors, the practices that primates engage in. So in a very general sense, if we think back to Darwin and Darwin's idea of common ancestry, primates are part of a much larger story of organic biological evolution. Primates exist along what we can think of as a continuum of biological traits and behaviors. And humans are certainly part of that continuum. We are just a more recent branch in the tree of life that Darwin sketched. And one of the things that we start to observe, and we'll see this more in the second half of our semester, thanks in part to the contributions of archaeology, is that the last common ancestor between humans and in particular chimpanzees, but we can also think about apes a little bit more broadly here, probably existed somewhere around 6 to 7 million years ago. And this would probably explain why is it that we start to see so much genetic overlap between humans and in particular a lot of the apes, some of the old world monkeys that we'll talk about in this segment, both in terms of, yes, our genetics, some of our physical traits, and then more and more our behaviors. So when we're talking about the commonalities both in physical and then in behavioral characteristics of non-human primates and primates, in some ways we're also talking about the evolution of our own species. How is it that we actually go about studying non-human primates? This is something of its own debate within the subfield or sort of subdiscipline of primatology. You have essentially two schools of thought or two approaches. They're not necessarily mutually exclusive. You can study primates in their natural habitats under sort of natural conditions or as natural as can be in the sort of field of ethology versus bringing primates into captivity, into laboratory settings, and conducting behavioral experiments with them in that capacity. So the two images here, the sort of striking distinctions between Jane Goodall, who we'll talk about more later in this module, working with chimpanzees in the quote-unquote wild, versus Koko the gorilla. Koko is very famed in her own time for being an ape, a gorilla in particular, who was able to acquire many different signs and means of communication, but most of the research, pretty much all of the research that I'm aware of that was done with Koko, was done in a laboratory setting. So different approaches, but as we'll start to see, they can really be useful when brought together to understanding things, especially the complex behaviors that primates engage in. So one of those first fundamental things that we're looking at this week are the social structures. As I said before, primates with some exceptions such as orangutans, which are primarily solitary creatures. For the most part, a big common characteristic, behavioral characteristic that we find amongst the primate order is that primates live in groups. They're certainly not the only animals or mammals to do so, but as we'll start to see here, the internal organization of these groups tends to be a little bit more complicated than, say, ants or schools of fish. No disrespect or shade to ants or schools of fish. So group living, a very common feature that we find amongst primates, and in particular, a lot of those old world monkeys such as baboons, but also as we start to get into the apes of Africa, chimpanzees being a big one. What are some of the factors or some of the sort of elements that influence the structures of these groups, but also more specifically the size of these groups? The list could go on, but two that I really want us to focus on here being the distribution of resources and also levels of predation. So by predation, what we're essentially looking at here is that we'll start to see primates tend to, as they gain these more generalized structures, that doesn't necessarily mean that the generalized structure puts them at the top of the food chain in their respective environments. And actually, in many instances, such as with baboons, which tend to favor living in open savanna environments, if you were to take an individual baboon and pit them against one of their major predators, such as a leopard, chances are the individual baboon is not going to fend very well in that fight. But baboons living in their troops, as they are often called, which can sometimes number upwards or close to 100 members, can work together and do work together oftentimes to surveil their land, their territory, to detect predators, and then in some instances, such as shown in this photo here, to actually chase off some of those predators. They can work together to chase off a leopard. But again, group living tends to favor and lend itself to this predation detection. We'll also see that the distribution of resources can also impact the size and in some aspects the behaviors of primate groups. So back to baboons, we see as an example where when you tend to have an environment that lends itself to widely distributed, abundant resources, group living tends to prosper in that kind of environment. So baboons, primarily vegetarians almost, if you're in these open savanna grassland environments, there can be a lot of resources, so it doesn't necessarily lead to as much internal group competition for resources, although baboons definitely have their own internal competition regarding other topics, which we'll talk about more later in this module. If we start to look at what are sometimes referred to as the lesser apes, the gibbons and the siamangs, which are found off the islands and most areas of Southeast Asia, where you have resources, but that tends to be more clumped resources or maybe resources, food sources that are only seasonal. In these instances, you might find smaller groups or bigger groups, but when it comes time to food acquisition, they kind of break apart into smaller units. So resources and their distribution are definitely an important factor that will shape size and structure of groups. When we start to look inside of those groups and figure out what is it or how is it that primates maintain our relationships within these larger communities, we start to find is that while maybe, and Park sort of references this at the outset of his chapter, that maybe aspects of this are kind of biologically innate, but what's quite interesting about primates is that a lot of this seems to be things that play out throughout the course of their lives based on their interactions with others. And some of these things we'll look at more specifically in later sections, such as forms of communication. But what I want to talk about here, at least, are the hierarchical structures or the organization of these groups. Because one of the things that we see is that by and large, primate groups, especially the bigger groups, have a certain ranked system. That is to say, individuals have different statuses within those groups. And they oftentimes tend to be ones that are really stark. That is to say, others within the group recognize those ranks. But we'll also want to qualify that a little bit and talk about some of the complexities. Park references this a little bit with talking about baboons. We'll talk about some other more recent research that's been done around that as well. One of the big things, though, that we want to talk about right away is that dominance hierarchies, even though you've probably heard it talked about as like alpha males, that's associated with one form of dominance hierarchy, but it's certainly not the only one amongst primates. So you have male dominant systems, which could be represented in some cases by baboons, or as featured here, gorillas. I love this image because you see the alpha male there, kind of with his arms crossed, looking quite, I don't know, upset, perturbed. I see a sitcom there. I just don't exactly know what the premise is. But we also find instances, primates, that will have female dominance hierarchies in the case of ring-tailed lemurs, and even instances in which there doesn't seem to be a stark divide of power or rank between the male and female sexes, such as bonobos. And as we'll also see here in this section in the supplemental video, bonobos have many other strategies that are kind of unique to them that they've used and deployed to resolve internal group conflicts. A couple of caveats here, or things to point out with these dominance hierarchies, despite them being quite widespread amongst primates, is that hierarchies and an individual's rank within those hierarchies more specifically is largely learned. That is to say, it's not necessarily something that is purely determined by biology. So, though there is some instances, such as amongst macaques, where it seems to be that offspring inherit some aspects of their mother's rank within a group. So, for example, if the mother is highly ranked within that macaque group, it's likely that their offspring will be treated by others within the group with a certain degree of, we might almost say, like reverence. That is to say, they might have access to more food resources, for example. But very, very importantly, there's always the potential for those offspring to lose their rank or their status throughout the course of their life, largely as a result of conflict and competition from others. Again, the baboons become a very striking example of this that we'll see in the next section. Another thing that I like to point out with regard to dominance hierarchies, I think sometimes people take the wrong lesson from this, which is that, non-human primates have hierarchically organized systems, therefore hierarchy amongst humans is in some respects natural or beneficial. And it might very well be that some degree of hierarchy amongst all primates, including humans, is natural, or at least is, historically present and we can point to it. But the idea that it's purely beneficial is something that we want to qualify, because when we're thinking about things in an evolutionary perspective, we want to also recognize that there's usually a cost and benefit going on with any given trait, even a behavior, even something like hierarchically organized social systems. So one of my favorite studies from recent years also involves baboons. Again, baboons living in large, complex groups tend to lend themselves to these hierarchy studies. One of the things that the researchers have observed is that there's definitely benefits, especially for the males, for being really highly ranked within their groups. They tend to have greater access to mating partners, so females within the group, and they also tend to have, first pick of food resources. So that's all obviously beneficial to the highly ranked individual, but what they've also noticed is that for some of those most highly ranked individuals in these baboon troops, is that as you move up the hierarchy, the stress levels increase. And they've actually been able to measure this in terms of the cortisol levels of males within baboon troops. And they think that this is tied to some of the responsibilities that come with being atop the hierarchy. So males, even though if they're highly ranked, they're going to get access to mating partners, resources, they're also now responsible for protecting females within the group, also infants within the group. We mentioned before, baboons have to face predators in their open savanna environments. On top of that, they're also oftentimes always having to deal with challenges from lower-ranking males who want to unseat them and unseat their position. Again, we'll see an example of this in the next section regarding primate forms of communication. So just to keep in mind there that when we're talking about these dominance hierarchies, yes, very much widespread within the primate order, but they will look different in some instances based on location, based on the species, and there's always a sort of cost-benefit analysis at work.